everyone, and thank you for joining us today to the first lecture of this semester, our special lecture series of the Korea-Europe Center. This time we are focusing on global Korea and the impact of Korea globally. My name is Gwendoline Domling. I am currently a research assistant at the Korean Institute at the Freie Universität Berlin in Germany, and also a doctoral student. And I have the pleasure to welcome our first lecturer, Dr. Bae Kyung Min from the Philippines, who is going to present on Korean cultural impact and hybridization, a phenomenon in the Philippines. So before going into more detail and introducing our special guest today, I would just like to mention that the Korea-Europe Center is a joint project by the Institute of Korean Studies and the Freie Universität, and also the KDI, meaning the Korean Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management. We manage different projects, and the special lecture series is one of the pillars beside workshops and educational programs and also conferences where experts can exchange new and good research on Korea and all the matters surrounding it. Before introducing our star, Dr. Bae Kyung Min, I would like to make a few technical announcements. So first of all, this lecture will be recorded and may later find its way to our YouTube channel of the Korean Institute. Thus, please be aware of that fact. And second, I, the moderator Gwendoline, will later manage or moderate a short question and answer sessions where our guest, Dr. Bae Kyung Min, is going to try to answer all your questions. If you have questions, please write them down through the chat function of WebEx, or later raise your hand using the raise your hand feature of WebEx and ask your questions directly. I will call and also reiterate your questions for you if you'd like to, and this is everything on my side, on the technical side. So now to the most important thing, the introduction of our guest lecturer, Dr. Bae Kyung Min. So, Dr. Bae Kyung Min is currently an assistant professorial fellow at the Department of Linguistics, College of Social Science and Philosophy at the University of the Philippines-Diliman. Furthermore, she is officer in charge at the Korea Research Center, University of the Philippines. Among other things, she is also a language education expert and received her Ph.D. from the university she currently teaches at. Her research interests are diverse and cover Korean language teacher education, non-native language teacher identity, heritage language learners, as well as Korean migration in the Philippines. After this short introduction, I would like Dr. Bae Kyung Min to turn on her video, and if she is ready, to give us the honor to start her presentation.
Yes, thank you so much for a very sweet introduction. To start my talk today, I will firstly share my slides here. I will just read the title of my lecture first. When I was asked to join this lecture series, I was thinking of what will be interesting for students in Germany or in some other parts of the Europe, because the living environment and the how Korean culture evolved is really different in Asia, especially in the Philippines. I was trying to reflect what is really happening in the Philippines in terms of Korean culture and its development. I just tried to make the title such as Korea landed on Philippine shores, because I got the idea from the famous Korean drama from last year, which was Crash Landing on You, if some of you have watched it. And then the subtitle of my presentation is Korean Culture Impact and Hybridization Phenomenon. So later on, I will share lots of pictures because maybe some of you have been to the Philippines, but given that many of you haven't been to the Philippines, I just show you the landscape of the Philippines in terms of Korean culture. So you can have some ideas and you can also imagine how Korean culture impact in Germany and in the Philippines are quite distinctive or quite different or similar. So let me start from the outline of my presentation. To give you some context of the Korean culture in the Philippines, first of all, I will talk about Korea-Philippines relations, and this will be a very brief historical glimpse. And then I move on to Korean diaspora in the Philippines. Like in Germany, the Korean diaspora is very distinctive, and it's one of the crucial research topics for Korean studies scholars as well. So since there should be some similarities as well, I will just touch some part of Korean diaspora, especially in the Philippines. And then we move on to the main topic of today, visibility of Korean culture in the Philippines and Korean culture content consumption. So here we can see the consumer behavior and how Korean culture fans in the Philippines really mobilize. And then lastly, I just introduce you some Philippine government agencies who are benchmarking or who are closely observing how Korean culture is gaining popularity in the global arena. And lastly, very brief, but I will also introduce you to our research center in the University of the Philippines. So to start off, let me just give you a very brief historical glimpse when it comes to the Philippines and Korea. By the way, to just share my personal background, I have been living in the Philippines for about 11 years so far, but my first choice to teach Korean language was not the Philippines. So because of the reason, when I came to the Philippines, I also learned so many new things about the country and also fascinating facts about two countries. So hopefully this introduction can also boost some interest among you. When I talk about Philippines-Korea connections, I would like to introduce you to three iconic people from 19th century to early 20th century. So the first one is the fisherman from Korea. The fisherman's name was Moon Sun-deuk, and maybe some of you have heard his name or some of you have watched some documentary film about him. The reason we know about Moon Sun-deuk in the 21st century is quite funny. Because if you see the right side, I present you the Korean map with the ocean, right? So here, Uido Island was Moon Sun-deuk's hometown, which is quite near Jeju Island. So he was just one of the ordinary fishermen who goes to fish every day with other group of Korean fishermen. But one day, there was very bad weather and the tide was very high, so his boat was drifted away to Ryukyu. Ryukyu was in 19th century Okinawa. Currently, we call it Okinawa Island, right? But during that time, it was Ryukyu country. So they had no choice, but they stayed in Ryukyu for some time, hoping that they can go back to their hometown anytime soon. But if you follow the arrow, you can see the arrow goes even further south, right? They arrived in Luzon Island in the Philippines. But during that time, just like Ryukyu was the name of the country, there was no such name Philippines as a name of the country. So during that time, it was known to Korea as Luzon country. So Moon Sun-deuk and other Korean fishermen arrived in Vigan, Ilocos in Luzon Island. So during that time, they had no choice once again, but they decided to stay because that was really what just happened. But Moon Sun-deuk, as a stranger in Luzon Luzon Island, was rather optimistic and he was very adventurous. So he tried to experience some new cultures that he encountered first time in his life, and he tried to remember things like different landscape and different culture, even the language they spoke in Vegan Island. So after they finished their stay in Luzon Island in the Philippines, they went to Macau and then China, and then they finally arrived in Korea, in his hometown. So the reason we know about Munsun-deuk's adventure is because of the book 표해 시말. So you can see one of the pages of 표해 시말 in the middle of the picture here. So 표해 시말 was written by Jeong Yak-jeon, one of the scholars in Joseon Dynasty. And then 표해 시말 includes the adventurous story of Munsun-deuk. And at the end of 표해 시말, it also included kind of mini dictionary. So the language spoken in the province Munsun-deuk arrived was Ilocano language. So since Munsun-deuk clearly remembered the language, the book included Ilocano language and Korean language. So the Korean history records that this is first ever Ilocano, which is one of the Philippine languages, and Korean dictionary. So this is how we remember Munsun-deuk, one of the ordinary fishermen. But when it comes to the Philippines and Korea relations, this is quite remarkable because it was when there was no diplomatic relations and there was no technology, but there was one citizen from Joseon Dynasty who traveled and who remembered and who tried to share his experience in Luzon Island. And then the second iconic person is the priest, the first Catholic priest from Korea. He was Saint Andrea Kim Dae-gon. So the priest Kim Dae-gon was living in the 19th century as well during Joseon Dynasty, but his life was rather short because during that time, the foreign religion was regarded as somewhat contaminating the native beliefs, right? So because of the life being threatened and because of less security in Korea, they traveled to China and then Macau, so they could really keep practicing their religious beliefs. But after Macau, you can also see the right side, the map here. After they stayed in Macau, because there was a civil war, so to protect themselves from the war in Macau, they moved to Manila in the Philippines around 6 months of time. But when they stayed in Manila, there was also some things going on, so they needed some more peaceful place to stay. So this is why they went to, you can read the name of the place here, Lolomboy, Bocaue, Bulacan. Bulacan is one of the small province in the Philippines. It's maybe around 2 hours from Manila, which is the capital city of the Philippines. But during that time, when Kim Dae-gon, as a Catholic brother, stayed in the Philippines, the travel time was much longer than the current present time. So the reason Kim Dae-gon and other Korean brothers stayed in Lolomboy was to practice and to study in a rather peaceful environment. And then after they finished their stay, around 6 or 7 months of stay in the Philippines, they went back to Macau, if you follow the arrow, and then through the landline in China, they finally went to Korea. But unfortunately, he and other Korean priests were persecuted, so their life was really short. But since the Philippines was already a Catholic country, because the Philippines was occupied by Spaniards during that time, and it was quite a nice place for Korean Catholics. So this is why Kim Dae-gon and other Korean Catholics really chose the Philippines as a site to stay and to study about the religion. So especially for Korean migrants or Korean Catholics who live in the Philippines, the figure Kim Dae-gon is quite remarkable because this is really a very close linkage to connect Filipinos and Koreans until the current time. The last iconic people is rather a group of people. They are called PEFTOK, P-E-F-T-O-K. So PEFTOK is Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea. So as you see the picture from the top to bottom, you can already guess who are Pevtok, right? During the Korean War, Philippines was the first from Asian countries that deployed more than 7,000 soldiers to support South Korea. So this is still very meaningful, and this is one of the main reasons that Korean government still feels indebted, and they try to give back something to Pevtok veterans and Filipino citizens as well. Because as you see the picture above here, that was the very first winter these young Filipino soldiers experienced when they arrived in Korea in December 1950. And then if you follow the picture below, these old Filipino guys in blue vest are Pevtok veterans. Luckily, we still have quite a lot of Pevtok veterans alive, and they are mostly late 80s or in their 90s. So even if they are already very much aged, they are very active, and they try to share their lived history and their lived experiences, how they really participated in the Korean War and how they fought for the freedom so that South Korea can really enjoy the freedom up to the current generation. And then if you see the money here, this is the old 500 Philippine peso note. We currently have the new note using in the Philippines, but this was one of the senators who were closely linked to Korea, because if you see the back of 500 Philippine peso note, you can also see this guy, the late Senator Ninoy Aquino Jr. was also part of the Korean War, but not as Pevtok, because he didn't really fight in the battlefield, but he was a war journalist. So this is something Korean migrants, especially those Koreans who have been living in the Philippines very long time, always feel proud of, because this really shows how those iconic people are really connected to Korean history, not just modern history, but even before when Korea was struggling. And when we talk about Korean War and Pevtok, we also talk about how interracial marriage between Korean and Filipino citizens already existed about 70 years ago. So during that time, what was dominant was there were more Filipino grooms and Korean brides. So these Korean brides were like war bride, and most of them really followed their Filipino husbands, and they were regarded as one of the first group of migrants who settled in the Philippines. So when we see the history between two countries, we can see the presence of the Korean culture and Korean people in the 21st century in some bigger context. As we briefly saw some historical background, we can also remember the Korean diaspora in the Philippines. But we can just see since 20th century, because before 18th century, it was quite insignificant, even if at first I introduced you to Munsunduk, the fisherman, right, in 19th century. As the history shows, from 18th century to 1970, there were quite a lot of political migration from Korea to the Philippines, especially some Korean soldiers were deployed under the Imperial Japanese Army, so they were part of the Japanese Army. During that time, there was some misunderstanding that the people from Joseon, the Filipinos, thought they were all Japanese. So there was some misunderstanding as some research shows. And then I just showed you the war bride who married to Philippine husbands and followed to the Philippines. And then there were also few settlers who traveled from Korea for business or study. So who traveled to the Philippines for study or their undergraduate degree was quite insignificant and very few, but still it was quite interesting, because during that time, some Korean students really thought the Philippines was the destination for their higher degree. And then from 1970s to 80s, there were more Koreans who chose the Philippines because of business and investment goals. And there were also expats and those who worked for the international organizations like WHO or ADB. And then also there were also quite a lot of missionaries because Philippines is the Christian country, and there are quite a lot of Korean Christians or Catholic groups who chose the Philippines to expand their domain to recruit more community of their religion. And then education. So recently, I think we can think of this since 1990s up to the current era. Quite a lot of Koreans choose the Philippines because of leisure and tourism. And Philippines is the closest country among the ASEAN countries. So maybe that was one of the benefits that Philippines became quite popular among Koreans. And since Philippines is also English-speaking country, the education opportunity for the Korean parent to choose somewhat economically reasonable to send their kids to school was also part of the purpose to choose the Philippines. And business and investment, not just the big conglomerate, but the small and medium enterprises owners also chose the Philippines, especially when they hold the shipbuilding or shipment or the trading industry. Another interesting feature is retirement, because the Philippine government, just like Malaysia or Singapore or some other Asian countries, try to recruit more neighboring Asian people. So Philippine government issues SRRV, which is Special Resident Retirees Visa. So with this visa, it's like a permanent residency. So because the dual citizenship is not permitted, so if you hold this retirees visa, you have quite a lot of benefits, and you can enjoy the life like say my Filipino benefits. So this really attracted lots of Koreans, especially in their 50s or 60s. So we can see the trend has been somewhat different, but there have been quite a lot of Koreans who continue migrating to the Philippines. And I just mentioned this earlier, the proximity between two countries is really very close, and Philippines is a multilingual country that English is dominantly speaking. So this really was the beneficial point for Koreans. And then you can also see the number of visitor arrivals from Korea to the Philippines here. I just highlighted in yellow, but this is from 2020. So I think we have to consider these statistics was gathered during the pandemic season. But still, it was quite high compared to other nationalities. So if you see the right side, you can see 2019, the number of Koreans who really arrived in the Philippines was really much more than Americans or Chinese or other nationalities. So if you see the number of Korean migrants among the total population or in the Philippines, it's quite insignificant, because Philippines also has different ethnic groups and different group of minorities. But when it comes to the number, Koreans are not really counted huge, because the total population of the Philippines is quite big. But still, this is quite interesting point. You can remember that although the number or the statistics show a bit less than the impact of Korean culture we can really see in the Philippines, this really goes along how Korean culture really evolves in the Philippines, and also the Korean migration or Korean migrant communities also evolve. So we can see it later on in my slides. So here you can also see the Korean presence in the Philippines. In the left side, you can see some major Korean organizations that were formed since 1960s up to 1990s. So you can see the Korean Association Philippines, INC, which is currently this one, United Korean Community Association. They just changed the name. And then you can also see some church or mothers association and other different associations. And then to give back to the Philippines and to share what culturally common between two countries, Korean Association also holds its annual Philippines-Korea Culture Exchange Festival. I think this is quite similar to what other Korean migrant communities in other countries, including Germany, are doing annually or regularly. So right now, there's no official Koreatown in Manila or in the Philippines because these enclaves are just informal. Like those Koreans open business, and then some Koreans also follow. So the business boomed, and then the community just flocked with some Korean business owners, but it is still informal. So there's no legitimate name of Koreatown in the Philippines. So this is why in Manila City is in Metro Manila because Metro Manila is the official capital city of the Philippines. So in Manila City, some group of Korean community leaders gathered, and they decided to formally inaugurate the Manila Koreatown. So because of pandemic, it's been delayed, and we don't know yet when it will really officially kick off. But as you see the picture here, they met the mayor of the city, and they already had some kind of ceremony. So hopefully by next year, we can also see some meaningful face of Manila Koreatown in Metro Manila, where Koreans and also Filipinos can really enjoy each other's culture. Aside from the capital city, other cities or other provinces also have informal Koreatown. So you can see some artifacts that were built by Koreans, and also the Korean community tries to protect Korean citizens, and also they try to partner with the police or the army so that they can also contribute to the safety of the neighborhood. And also they try to contribute to the society as a migrant, that during the pandemic, some less privileged Filipinos are really struggling because there's really no business, and there's really a serious unemployment problems as well. So Korean people also held this community pantry where people can freely share some food or some cooking ingredients. So this is how Koreans exist in the Philippines, and how Koreans are really trying to merge into the local society, even if they are migrants from outside. So here we can move on to the next topic, visibility of Korean culture in the Philippines. Because in the first part, I just talked about some historical linkages, right? And then I just explained the diaspora, how Koreans really moved on settling in the Philippine shore. So here we can see how Korean culture is visible and what impact it has. The first picture here is the headline of one of the newspapers that UP-Diliman. UP is University of the Philippines, my university. So UP offers a Korean drama elective class. So it was last year, and it was really the talk of the town, because even media and even the universities were curious how Korean drama can really learn, or how Korean drama can really be taught as an elective course in the university. So it was quite interesting and a very remarkable moment, that the Korean culture, or especially Korean drama, is not really just to watch for fun, but there's something we can approach academically, and university students can also learn, and they can also apply what they have learned from Korean dramas, not just watching for fun, and then they can be practitioners in different media sectors. So that was the main takeaway from Korean dramas, and then it was developed into an elective class in my university. And then I think when I watch YTN TV news, sometimes I also find it very interesting when they feature some news in European countries, that the fandom, especially K-pop fandoms, have been growing remarkably in different countries in Europe. So quite similar phenomenon happens in the Philippines, like this one, K-dance party. This is really targeting the fandom, especially K-pop enthusiasts, how they can really show the love of K-pop or K-dance. So at first, it was not really very active movement by the consumer or the fans. But right now, I think fans are not passive anymore, but they're really proactive and they really want to show how much they love Korean culture. They found interesting. So I will just go in, a bit deeper in each sector, like drama or movies or music. First of all, before Korean dramas really hit Philippines, there used to be some other famous dramas in the Philippines. They call it telenovela, like novel. So soap opera in the Philippines used to be called and still called telenovela because it's like you read a novel on TV, right? So in the late 90s, there used to be so many Mexican telenovelas which invaded Philippine TV, spearheaded by Marimar. So you can see the image of Marimar TV drama here. So in 90s, there used to be so many Mexican dramas and Filipinos. Perhaps the theory is because of some somewhat common Hispanic culture still remaining in the Philippine culture, and perhaps the story really clicked among the Philippine TV viewers. It was really famous. But afterward, in early 2000, Asia novellas, so it moved to Asia, especially the Taiwanese dramas by airing of Meteor Garden. So this was also remade by Korea, right? The Voice Over Flower was the Korean title. And early 2000, there used to be so many Taiwanese dramas in the Philippines. So how did Korean drama really arrive? It was around 2004, or we can say around when Taiwanese dramas arrived in the Philippines. That was also time when Korean dramas were also massively imported by the local TV station. So we can recall that the Winter Sonata, the very famous Korean drama, which really took over Japanese islands around early 2000, also came to the Philippines, but in terms of the highest viewing rate, Full House really top among other Korean dramas. But you can see from 2004 and then 2006, and then around those times, there were already predominant Korean dramas beyond Taiwanese or Mexican novellas. So this also goes along with the theory by other scholars like Hallyu 1.0, because it was the time Korean dramas or films really went outside Korean peninsula, right? And also how Hallyu really kicked off outside Korean peninsula was throughout the Korean dramas and films rather than music or some other lifestyle industries. So you can see how the Korean dramas, especially in early 2000, really took over after some other used to be famous foreign dramas in the Philippines. And then here you can also see, even if Korean dramas arrived much later than Taiwanese dramas, the local TV stations were very aggressive to import or to buy the rights to air or to produce in their stations. And another interesting fact about this phenomenon is Philippine TV stations really love remakes. So there were so many Korean drama adaptations by Philippine local productions. So I think you can see some famous titles like Lovers in Paris or some other adapted dramas. Because when Korean dramas are aired in the local stations, usually it's dubbed. Unlike these days, when you watch Netflix, most people prefer subtitles, right? But when these Korean dramas were bought and aired in the local stations, it was mostly dubbed. So after they watched the dubbing version, they wanted to experience their own version of the drama with their favorite Filipino actors and actresses. So this is quite interesting phenomenon that can be found in the Philippines. And also, aside from dramas, I think after 2010, there were also quite a lot of attempts to remake Korean movies into Philippine versions. So these two were quite successful, like Miss Granny or Miracle in Cell Number 7. These really invested a lot of resources and also time. So it means they really studied the original film and then they tried to adapt it into the Philippine version, which can also click on the Filipino viewers. But another one I also observed was something Korean can appear in the local TV shows, and it really clicks among Philippine viewers or Philippine Korean culture fans. You can see here two examples I show you. This one is My Korean Jagiya. So if you have learned Korean language, obviously Jagiya is a Korean word, right? And then they also included some Hangul script here. This is completely local drama by GMA, one of the major TV stations, but they invited the Korean protagonist. So they really targeted Filipino viewers who are already immersed in Korean culture and who are already madly in love with Korean drama. They really wanted to demonstrate that, oh, this is what we can show you now. This is what we leveled up, and we can show you the mixture of different cultures like Filipino culture and Korean culture. And then this was another movie. The title was Kimidora, and the poster itself already shows the main character has some Korean lineages, and she shows some hits like some secretive life with some Korean people in Korea. So these are what the local TV stations and movie productions try to level up and also try to target, because they really know something Korean can really marketable and something Korean can really make people curious in this country. And next one is the music. And music is quite recent compared to drama and the film. So I just analyzed this as localization of K-pop. As you see here, this is a Filipino boy band, SB19. Their name is SB19, and they are the first ever Korea-trained P-pop idol group. So in the past, up to the present time, Philippine music is usually coined as OPM, original Philippine or Pinoy music. So there are different genres like ballad or dance or rock or jazz, all different genres, but it is really regarded as OPM. The label was OPM. But now that Philippine pop industry is also studying about how Korean industry evolved, especially K-pop, how they really manufactured some boy bands or girl bands. They really sent these 5 boys to Korea, and I think they had some training like almost 1 year or 2 years, and then they came back and it was quite successful, and so far they are making some remarkable movement. So another different movement is with these two representations. So here, if you see the group above, the name is Alamat. Alamat is composed of different boys, because if you see here, there are some different texts here, because these black texts mean the language they speak, because these boys are all from different provinces. Unlike Korea, Korea is a monolingual country, but Philippines is multilingual country, and there are more than 170 languages here. So when they formed this new concept of P-pop and new concept of P-pop band, they tried to project Filipino identity as well. And it's what I personally find it quite interesting, because when they studied about K-pop, or when they studied how K-pop really evolved and the revolution of K-pop past decades, they also thought how uniquely Filipino can really shown by their pop music. So this is why when they conceptualized this boy band Alamat, they really tried to infuse a lot of language and the costume and the other native culture they can find in the Philippines. And same concept goes with Bini. Bini is one of the famous girl group recently got famous, just like Alamat. So as you can see here, I'm not saying all the P-pop groups or the new trend of P-pop just followed K-pop. I'm not really saying that, but you can really see the elements of localized K-pop, like how they really want to seriously train the potential boy band or girl band members, and how they really seriously see the industry as a sustainable industry that can really move forward, so they can really go beyond the Philippines and they can also excel in the global arena. So this is how we can see the existence and somewhat impact of K-pop in the Philippine pop music scene, especially when we coin this P-pop. And then next one, I just show you quite a lot of pictures here because we just talked about how Korean culture is really visible and how Korean culture really has somewhat impact in different lifestyle of Filipinos. We can also see Korean landscape in the Philippines, especially in the urban area. And I just categorized into three. The first one is physical spaces, and then second is commercial or advertisement, and then the last is online spaces. So when you go to the department store or the famous malls or some other outdoor spaces, you can really see those enterprises try to make the use of their space into somewhat Korean. So like Chuseok, like the Mid-Autumn Festival or the Lunar New Year or some Korean festive days, they also try to plan activity space can transform into some Korean place. Especially it became quite a fad during the pandemic because people cannot really travel to Korea and they really miss going to Korea. So they just transformed into somewhat Korean place. So it feels like they are experiencing instead of traveling to Korea. So you can see here some designs they planned in the mall. And then what is visible outside the city is celebrity endorsement, because the celebrity endorsement is really very much working in the Philippines, especially with the big name of the brands and the companies. And recently, I think past 5 or 6 years, they really tried to hire the Korean celebrities, as you see here. One of the biggest clothing brands or smart communications, it's like one of the biggest communication company. And then you can also see lots of billboards outside, and you can also see how the shop windows try to project. They sell Korean stuff, and they have some Korean celebrity who are endorsing their brand. So this shows their brand value is higher. They really show the consumers that the brand is has leveled up, and this is why you have to choose our brand. So in the past, around 10 years ago, the endorsement was really with Hollywood stars, like the actors or actresses of the movie Twilight or other Hollywood series. But these days, the transition was really made from Hollywood to Korean celebrities. So especially, I could say this is really showing the urban space is dominated by Korean celebrities. And sometimes there's also backlash because this is too much, and some main road of the Metro Manila, it's really too much. So some Filipinos are curious, but at the same time, some of them have some negative sentiment about this phenomenon. And then regarding online space, some companies try to maximize the fandom and the gathering of Korean culture fans by opening like Viber group or using their social media. So they are holding K-Munity. K-Munity is like community, but they just used the K-dash because it shows something Korean, right? So they hold some cultural events, and also they try to project, they are importing lots of Korean shows, and especially the reality shows, and they feature them into their local station or their free TV stations. And then another recent phenomenon is since Korean drama was already prevalent, and then the movie, obviously, and then the music is still famous. And then the next level and next chapter that some Philippine industry was looking for was literature, because unlike in Europe, I also know that in many European countries, Korean books are selling very well, especially the translation is also very active. But in the Philippines, this just started past maybe 2 or 3 years. So one of the publishing houses here is APUB. APUB tried to buy some rights of Korean books, but they have so far bought some Korean essays, so that some Filipino readers can also easily access, and they can also experience what Korean books are like, and how they can really read Korean literature into English. So this is one of the recent industries that Korean culture is visible. I think one of the reasons is also that since Philippines is English-speaking country, and it can also tap other ASEAN countries who are equally English-speaking, like Malaysia or Singapore or other countries in the region. So they are trying to expand as the hub of Korean English translation sector. So in our research center, we also had 2 Korean Culture Forum last year and then this year. And hopefully we can invite all of you to our next year's forum next time. To just add some more, because of the pandemic and because of lockdown, what is quite significant is how the Netflix really skyrocketed in the Philippines, and what came with the fame of Netflix was Dalgona. I think currently Dalgona became even more famous because of Squid Game, but during March or April in 2020, last year, because everyone was really locked up in their house, and then they really watched so many Korean contents, especially Netflix, and they found some Korean food they could really enjoy at home, because in the past they thought Korean food should be consumed in the restaurant only. But as the lockdown was prolonged, they found Korean food can be made, and it was rather fun, and they can really buy lots of ingredients, and they can really make use of resources they can find. So one of them was Dalgona, and it was really like almost every day we heard about Dalgona from the mainstream media. And I just mentioned the food, and Korean food became quite staple among among Filipinos. Korean food was famous, like bulgogi or bibimbap, like those traditional menus. But what became famous was what Filipinos really watch from Korean dramas or movies, because they could imagine they can eat what their favorite celebrities eat in the dramas or movies. So I think to understand this one, I think we have to understand the Filipino psyche. Like you really want to experience what your celebrity is really doing in the show. So like budae-jjigae or samgyeopsal, these were quite new menus which never really existed in 1990s. And then there were quite a big marketing using like soju or BTS, or especially the McDonald's really earned so much money by using BTS marketing. And the hybridity is continuing. So here you can also see one of the interesting points I can really see in the Philippines is they really make hybridity, and they really blend not just language, but like visual wise or the recipe wise, they really blend Korean culture and Philippine culture. So especially when McDonald's had this like Korean burger, like K-burger campaign, they even featured somewhat Korean looking models. They could be Korean, but sometimes they are hired because of the Korean looking. and they try to project that there is Koreanness, but also there's Filipineness. So this is quite interesting. Like I mentioned, dramas and movies are adapted, right, into Philippine version. So now it's the time for food. So it's not just Korean food, but it's the Korean food for Filipinos, Korean food, which is somewhat Filipinized. So this hybridity phenomenon is what I really find it interesting currently. And then here, there are quite a lot of Philippine government agencies that are trying to benchmark, or they try to study about Korean cultural phenomenon. So here you can see Culture Center of the Philippines and National Commission for Culture and the Arts and Department of Foreign Affairs. It's like Minister of Foreign Affairs of Korea. So these are quite closely working with Korean Embassy and Korean Cultural Center in the Philippines as well. So I just mentioned just one example here. Kanto Kultura. Kanto is street. Kultura is culture. So CCP promoted this campaign of Kanto Kultura, where the Filipino talents can sing in their own native language and using native instruments. So just like I mentioned when I talked about SB19 or Alamat, those P-pop groups, they really try to demonstrate something unique Filipino, but they also anticipate this will go beyond the Philippines and it will really click the global viewers and global audience as well. And Fiesta Filipinas is like festivals. They introduce the Philippine festivals to outside world because currently there's no travel, and they try to brainstorm how they can really promote tourism and other cultural heritage to outside world. So just to sum up, I think there are some prospects in terms of Korean culture in particularly Philippine context. So Korean culture used to be niche market, but currently I think it's now that Korean culture came into the mainstream culture, but as I mentioned, there's also backlash and there's also some negative sentiment by some Filipinos. So I think when Korean culture arrives or Korean culture is introduced to the Philippines, I think there should be really a thorough study or thorough observation how and what kind of Korean culture can really be successful in the Philippines. And then Philippines is also moving forward as they also witness the value of economic value of creative industries. So as a state level, they are trying to propose some bills as well. And also, Philippines wants to be competitive, especially in ASEAN region. So I said Philippines is English speaking, and it has some benefits to work with other ASEAN countries. So how Korean culture is localized and how Korean culture evolves distinctively in the Philippines, I think there should be some lessons, or there should be some interesting points that we can observe in the future. So lastly, I just quickly introduce you to our research center. So our university has different campuses in nationwide because Philippines is composed of different islands, right? And then our research center was established in April 2016, and we are working as a Korean Studies Hub in the Philippines, and this is why I feel really honored to be part of this lecture series today. And then our main focus has three domains: research, education, and network. And we try to network with other Southeast Asian Koreanists, and also here some local organizations and other international universities like Korean universities or other universities. And then these are some publications our research center published past years. It's all free downloadable, so you can visit our Facebook page. You can just search UPKLC, or you can also visit our website, or you can always send us email so we can start networking, and we can always connect. We can be connected through online spaces. So this is the end of my presentation, and if you have questions, I will also try to answer in my knowledge. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Right now we don't have a question, but I have one. In the first part of the presentation, you talked more about the diaspora, the Korean diaspora, seeing the old organizations and the help that the Filipinos, for example, provided during the Korean War, and the networks that were mostly from Koreans, for Koreans. And afterwards, you talked more about the Hallyu influence in the Philippines. So the question I have is, how do these two tie together? Is the Hallyu actually becoming, the Hallyu influence becoming something useful for the development and the community of Koreans in Philippines? Is it empowering them, or is it maybe, as you already pointed out, maybe even hindering them because it creates sometimes resentments among the Filipino population? So how would you see that aspect? What are your thoughts on this matter?
Thank you for your question. And that is also one of the questions we also frequently talk about in the Philippines, because, as I mentioned, when you see the statistics of Korean migrants, I mean permanent settlers in the Philippines, the number is really very little. It's like maybe Koreans currently live around 90,000 out of Philippine population. So when Korean migrants settled, there was no K-pop, there was no Korean drama. So their purpose of migration was really purely business or other goals of their own life. But as the Korean culture became more prevalent and more famous, it really helped the migrants' life as well. And this is why just 2 years ago, the establishment of Koreatown in Manila City was also possible, because before then, even if K-pop was famous and Korean drama was famous, because the enclave or the migration community is still relatively small, I mean smaller than like Chinese Filipinos or other group of migrants, it was not really very significant to have Koreatown in the Philippines. But this is the time that Korean culture is really prevalent in Filipinos' lifestyle as well. It's not just music or drama, but it's now lifestyle. So food or fashion or some other like cosmetics or overall package exists in the Philippines. So I think I would say that kind of empowered Korean community, especially the long-term migrants, but also Korean migrants are being very cautious because they don't want to be they don't want to be seen like Korea is full of K-pop or Korea is just all of the modern culture, because they also want to preserve and they also want to represent the heritage of Korea. So but overall, I think there are much more positive impacts when it comes to Korean migration.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. But we have run out of time. The audience really enjoyed it, and I personally also really enjoyed your presentation. And thank you very much for being the first lecturer of this special lecture series on global Korea. We will hold further lectures on this topic, which will be announced through our website, the Institute of Korean Studies. So please check that out. And also, As Dr. Bae showed in her last slide, please check out all the publications if you're interested. And I would leave the last greetings and closing words to our guest, Dr. Kyung Min. So, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for staying until the end, and I hope to see you in person someday when things are getting better. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, this afternoon, because it's night in Manila. So thank you and take care.